Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul, and a bite-sized extra podcast for you this week as I chat about Paul's music with Absolute Radio's Director of Music, James Curran. Absolute is one of the UK's biggest, with decades radio stations from the 60s right up to now. James also looks after Magic Radio, a station that loves a bit of style council, and you do something to me as much as anyone. So let's get into it. Hi, James.
Hi there.
Absolute Radio, you guys are kind of king at two things, I would say. One, playing proper music on the radio, so the old kind of real music matters, and also king of the kind of decades. And I think, is it 7 decade stations now? It's 60s through to now to 20s. And for me, Weller is kind of both of those things. So real music, clearly, but also the only artist up there with Lennon and McCartney to have kind of number one album in 5 consecutive decades.
Absolutely. I mean, we play on the fact that real music matters to us, and that's a very subjective term. I do understand that. But real music for many of our listeners is about singer-songwriters. It's about people who write their own music, about people who play their own music. It's not produced or mass-produced, and they've not been put together by some management team or whatever. And Paul is very much part of that ilk. You know, my first introduction to Paul would be at school, in 1978. I'll be honest, I wasn't a punk or even particularly into new wave, but lots of my friends were. And I remember seeing a poster that one of them had put up on the classroom wall, actually, of these 3 very cool-looking young dudes in really sharp suits, which was quite in contradiction to what was going on in punk at the time, even though their music was classed very much, Jam's music was very much classed as part of the new wave. I liked this really sharp image, which kind of harked back more to kind of like bands like the Kinks and Small Faces, that 60s influence. But I was quite kind of intrigued about this band. And then I heard the music, and, from their introductory single in the City, and tracks like Strange Town and When We Were Young and Down in the Tube Station at Midnight. I think even if you weren't a punk or you weren't even into new wave, you could tell that this was classic songwriting from a very young band and a very young songwriter at the time in Paul Weller. And those songs, especially something like Down in the Tube Station at Midnight, I think it was written in 1978, that still stood up as a fantastic song, lyrically and musically. And I think that's one of the things that Paul has never really forgotten. I mean, right through his career, and even when he's a bit of a musical chameleon, because you think that he's gone from the new wave and the punk of the Jam, who I remember by the time they got to 1980 were the biggest band in Britain. They were having number one singles. I think, I might be wrong on this, but they may have been the first act ever to go straight into number one in the UK singles chart, which I think was with Going Underground. They had a phenomenal fan base who would go out and buy their records first week. And they were, Start was a number one, Town Called Malice was a number one. That period, 1980 to 81, that was a real purple period for the Jam. And again, classic songs, something like Town Called Malice and Going Underground are songs we still play on Absolute. And, they're timeless. And, you hear a Town Called Malice and something like Billy Elliot, it still stands up. It has a further cultural value, because it's getting used in movies and TV programs. But yeah, I think Paul has just managed to be this musical chameleon, because then he went from the Jam to the Style Council, which was effectively a soul project. It was, and it was interesting for me as someone who was more of a soul boy than a punk, that Paul was a soul boy who just happened to be in a punk new wave band. And, and he explored that kind of, soul with Long Hot Summer and, just great soulful jazzy tracks at the time. And then in the 90s, he became this, really cool singer-songwriter again, going back to the guitar and, making great tracks like Wildwood and Broken Stones. And, it's just, I think he's just managed to remain relevant. That is the key to someone who becomes an icon. I think, it's probably an overused word, but you could say that Paul Weller is definitely an icon in the UK.
I mean, obviously I'm a super fan, so I would say that. But I think I remember a few years back listening to Absolute, and you guys kind of running this ultimate music icon kind of search, and I think the top 10 was kind of people you probably would expect, like the Stones and the Beatles and Bowie, and I think Queen were number one. But but Weller was there in the top 10. What is it do you think makes those kind of artists, those kind of, that difference between a kind of an everyday band to a band or an artist that kind of becomes an icon?
I mean, having that longevity can only come from, great songwriting. And I think Paul has had a chart career of 43 years, something like that now. I think 1977 was when In the City came out. And I think the band formed in 1972. So the Jam formed in 1972 at school in Woking. And I think so, he's been doing music for 48 years. But for 43 of them, he's had chart success. I mean, you just said that he's had number ones albums across 5 different decades. And you just do not get that. You do not get that longevity in a career. On Sunset, he's probably produced one of his, best solo albums in many, many years. And Absolute's ended up playing 2 of those songs on our playlist already. So I think longevity comes from great songwriting. And why does Paul Weller remain relevant still? I think because he's authentic. And I think authenticity counts for so much. I think especially when you're having that connection with fans, they've got to believe in you and trust in you. And I think, I think his fans are devoted to him. I get that from the absolute sort of requests that we get in. Paul is one of the most requested artists, whether it's across the Jam, Paul Weller, less so Style Council for some reason, but they do get requested. But it's mostly the Jam and solo Paul Weller amongst the Absolute Radio crowd. They just love him. They just absolutely love him. And he has such an amazing body of work. It's not surprising why.
I do send a lot of text, James. You're right.
You send more for the Style
50 feet of text is killing me. The other thing I was going to ask you quickly was around sessions. So you obviously have kind of set up a lot and have great relationships with the record labels, as well as kind of darted around different labels over the years. But you've kind of set up sessions. You've run interviews with him at festivals and in your studios and stuff. And obviously, this podcast exists, like I say, for me to gear up to the big one, to be able to interview Paul myself. What things do those kind of artists demand and want from you and the station? And have you got any tips in terms of how to approach kind of interviewing somebody like that?
I think with Paul, you need to know about him and his career, and you come to him, as I'm sure you would, Dan, with a lot of knowledge of his backstory, both musically and family-wise and the rest. And I think he's quite a cerebral man, but with no pretensions about it. But he is a very clever, intelligent man. I think he looks for that in other people as well, or at least that's a connecting point. In terms of demands, he's not a demanding person. Quite the opposite. For someone of his status, for the sessions and gigs that we've done with Paul in the past, we've dealt with far less big artists than Paul, who've been far more demanding. So, he's a fairly, humble guy, and that's great when you see that in such an iconic artist, a legendary artist like Paul Weller, that they don't come with pretensions, and they don't come with these ridiculous demands, whatever it's for some ridiculous rider or whatever. That's not him. And with Paul, it's very much about the music. He's not so, he's a very snappy dresser still, and he looks incredibly cool still, but he's not someone who's obsessed with the image. I don't think what he does comes naturally. It's not manufactured. I don't think he thinks too much about it. He knows what he likes, he knows what his influences are. I don't think he goes out of his way to, I must dress like this to make a statement, or I've got to consider my image, or I don't think that's him at all. I think it's all about the music with him. And everything else that comes with that, I think, is natural. And yeah, it does add to that kind of allure. Incredibly cool guy. He's making this incredible, amazing music. Still just adds to his kind of allure.
And James, clearly, a man yourself who's kind of passionate, talk about passion for music. Clearly, you're somebody of that ilk as well in terms of career and kind of, working in radio and broadcast and stuff. What kind of keeps you in it? What keeps you passionate about this world that we live in?
I think there's always something new to discover, whether that's a new artist or a new song or a new music style. I'm very lucky. I work across Absolute and Magic stations as well. So I work across 15 different brands. So we are playing all different types of music, everything across all of our stations. You'll find everything from Nirvana to Frank Sinatra, depending on what station you're listening to. So, I love all music. I think there's no such thing, I think, as a genre of music that is either better than others or worse than others. I think there's always good and bad within each music genre. And I think, I love guitar music for sure. And finding new great singer-songwriters or new bands who are making great music. I think that's still an exciting thing, and I'm very lucky to be able to do it.
Thanks, James. What a lovely guy and another fabulous guest on the podcast. Next up, and I can't wait to share this one with you, as I'm joined by the wonderfully funny Weller superfan Trevor Neal. Yes, he's the Trevor-looking half of TV comedy duo Trevor and Simon, or as it says on his email signature, the better-looking half. We learned about his discovery of punk, to the Jam, and the band Coming to Town, and we learned that he has so many things in common with Paul that he might as well be known as Trevor Weller. Get ready to swing your pants next week on the show.